Right, there we go. You're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kaya Sitole, and welcome to this very important conversation about the funding of higher education. As students get back to universities and as universities get ready to accept students for a new academic year, it is obviously quite important to reflect on the most recent developments in relation to the financing and the funding of higher education. I think most of us on this particular conversation are aware of the very complicated recent history of the student funding conundrum. A few years ago, during the fees must fall crisis, a lot of the issues were then brought into the fore, and it became quite clear that South Africa as a country still had a lot of challenges relating to finding the right model for funding and financing higher education. Since then, there have been some very critical developments, the first one perhaps being the announcement in December 2017 that NSFAS, the Student Financial Aid Scheme, would indeed be revising its qualification criteria. So up until that point in time, you had to have a family income of below 122,000 Rand in order to qualify. Naturally, this meant that many students quite simply were excluded from participating in that system due to the fact that their family incomes were above that particular threshold. That threshold, regrettably, had not been updated for many, many years, in spite of not only the increasing costs of higher education, but also the inflation that everybody is subjected to. That particular decision of December 2017 moved the threshold from 120,000 Rand to 350,000 Rand, which obviously meant that many more students could indeed qualify to be financed by the state, but it also widened the access. And of course, it had implications for the capacity of universities to enroll students. That number, unfortunately, still left a few students, well, a few too many students actually out of the loop. And these are the students whose family income was above the 350,000 Rand threshold. But of course, since we know how expensive higher education can be, it doesn't necessarily mean that any family that earns over 350,000 Rand is able to finance access to higher education. That missing middle conundrum, which we then came to define as students falling within that band of 350,000 Rand to 600,000 Rand, found themselves then perhaps at a loss when it came to comprehensive solutions for how they should be funded. The consequence of that is that over the past few years, there have been many deliberations about what needs to be done and how this particular group can be funded. We have had some initiatives that have been largely successful, and I think USASA Student Financial Aid Program probably being the one example of what we've seen in relation to the funding of missing middle students. However, as an organization that is private and private sector and public sector led rather than a government initiative, it has its resource limitations. And of course, that means that not everybody that qualifies to be funded has indeed been funded. This year, there has been perhaps a more comprehensive and a more, decisive development from government itself, where the Minister of Higher Education announced that NSFAS would then be given this additional mandate of essentially running an additional program relating to the financing and funding of missing middle students. And that simply means that NSFAS has now been given the responsibility to put together a loan scheme that is going to address the missing middle students. And of course, what that does is that it has implications for universities. It has implications for the planning and enrollment of universities. It also has implications for students who are now obviously either going to participate in this particular program or still seek alternative programs. We thought that today we would take some time to reflect on these particular developments and hear from critical stakeholders in higher education about, firstly, what this all really means for students in particular and for higher education institutions. But also, as we now know, the rolling out of such big, major public initiatives always comes with particular challenges and with particular learning and lessons. We want to be able to reflect on whether what we've seen in the past few years has given us enough insights and enough knowledge to be able to know how this new development should be seamlessly run and seamlessly implemented in order to ensure that we do not actually see the casualties of a very good decision in principle. Our panel today represents the cross-section of the higher education landscape. We do have perhaps the one person whose responsibility it is to keep and maintain a bird's eye view over the system at large in her capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa. Now, Universities South Africa is, of course, an organization that essentially is a platform for all the 26 public higher education institutions to deliberate on key issues affecting the sector, to deliberate on policy engagements with the state, and of course, to be able to give insights to the general public at large about the shape, the issues, and the sectoral issues. Critical matters that affect the higher education landscape. Dr. Phetiwe Matutu joins us in her capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa, and she is our first panelist. Our second panelist is someone who has worked in higher education for a very long time and has a very intimate understanding of what happens within the classroom, but also quite recently within the administration side of the higher education landscape. In his capacity as the Chief Financial Officer of the University of Cape Town, he probably has to deal with the one institution where the issues relating to the questions of funding and financing are quite acute, given the nature of the profile of students that tends to go to the University of Cape Town, but also the costs associated with accessing the University of Cape Town, given the fact that it is based within the metropolitan area, where we now know that the costs of accommodation in particular are quite much higher compared to other areas. And of course, that has significant implications for the ability of the university to attract the type of talent that it wants, to be able to ensure that it is as diverse an institution as it can be, and to also be able to ensure sustainability and viability as a public higher education institution. Our second panelist is also the chairman of the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, in addition to being the CFO of UCT, and that is Mr. Vincent Mutulo. Our third panelist represents a very key stakeholder in the higher education and human development and skills development landscape, because sector education and training authorities play a very critical role in really being at the epicenter of this continuum between the world of learning and the world of work. We do know that as higher education institutions prepare candidates and prepare students for the world of work, it is equally important for those that have an insight or the pulse into the workplace to be able to continuously engage with higher education institutions to ensure that at the end of the journey, the educational journey, students can indeed transition seamlessly into the world of work. We also do know that SETAs do have capacity to really leverage a lot of resources based on the fact that they are able to collect levies from the employers in their sector, and how those levies are then channeled into the different skills development initiatives, which of course include higher education. Our two panelists that represent the sectoral education and training authorities are Disambande, who is the acting Chief Executive Officer and the permanent CFO of SETA, and also Robin Vilagazi, who's a skills delivery and quality assurance executive at the Energy and Water SETA, which is based in Parktown. So thank you very much to all my panelists. We'd also like to hear from you as our audience. And of course, as you can see, there is a Q&A and a chat box. So as the conversation evolves, we'd like to hear your insights and your input in what you have seen as the key challenges on the ground floor as you're working with universities and with students, and perhaps how this development may address some of the issues that have emerged in recent years. Without further ado, I would like to call upon Dr. Phetiwe Matutu from the Universities of South Africa to give us just the first insight or the first reactions from Universities of South Africa about this new development that was announced by the Minister of Higher Education a couple of weeks ago, which was to say, as the government, we have listened, we've identified that there is indeed a gap in relation to the funding of missing middle students. And given the resource limitations, we will not be able to offer the grant system that is available to students below 350,000 Rand, but a loan system is where we're going to go. What was the reaction of USAF when it came to that, Dr. Matutu?
Thank you very much, MC, and good afternoon to the participants of this webinar. And thank you very much for being invited by ISFAP to be part of this panel. For us as Universities South Africa, we consider it quite exciting that the department, through the Ministry of Higher Education and Training, has made this announcement that we are going to be having the missing middle, which means that these are the students which have got income in their homes between 350 and below 600,000. We've had a negative experience with these students because the debt from the student fees has accumulated. At least by 2020, we're talking about 20 billion. And these students were quite substantially involved in that debt, to such an extent that as University of South Africa, we decided that we should work with the institutions, private and SETAs, to try and eradicate this debt as much as possible. We've had a little bit of success in that, we've had between 2020 and 2022, about 597 million devoted towards funding of students. 22,000 were funded, and 14,000 out of those were those which were owing universities loans, and they were able to graduate after being funded and also being able to proceed with their studies in the cases where they had to do postgraduate studies. So we consider it to be a huge achievement. However, there are concerns. And the first one being our ability as a system to manage the operations. As you can hear, the criteria have just come out, and NSFAS has just started now to look at the applications, which will be completed on the 15th of February. Already by then, some of the universities would have closed their registration. So it's very important that when we are talking about the operations, we talk about alignment, a seamless alignment within the system, where the university dates are properly aligned with the NSFAS dates, and everybody knows about that in advance. So the operations are very important. And then the other aspect, which from our side is a concern, or at least an area where we are interested in getting more information on, is the sustainability of the loan scheme, because it has been identified that a certain portion of it is coming from the National Skills Fund, a portion of it is coming from the SETAs. The question is, come next year, what will happen, and the other year, and the other year. So the sustainability component is very, very important. And also from our side, we would like to acknowledge the fact that institutions such as ISFAP have been very, very instrumental in growing the funds for this missing middle through the private sector. That's another very, very critical component which we feel needs to be grown more and will show a little bit of sustainability. Thank you very much, Emson.
Dr. Matutu, as a follow-up to that, I mean, one of the key questions that emerged from the moment the announcement was made was whether there was indeed a universal understanding of how big the funding gap is, and whether indeed the state, through its NSFAS scheme, would actually be able to adequately budget for whatever amount of loan funding may be required. I imagine that University of South Africa is probably in the unique position to have an understanding of just how many students have historically tried to access universities only to be denied on the basis that they didn't meet the criteria to be granted traditional NSFAS funding and also didn't get access to other means of funding. Do we have any idea of just how big the type of student population that will be affected by this new development might be? Or is this something that universities are now actively trying to interrogate in order to be able to understand exactly what the big exposure might be for the state in relation to this new scheme?
I think let's try and imagine this group of students. It's not nice to have a loan. It is a solution. Let's agree on a number of solutions to the issue of the missing middle. Others will be self-funded within the missing middle. Loan is a possibility, but let's look at initiatives such as the one that is being spearheaded right now by institutions such as USAF together with ISFAP of bursaries. Because, you know, after graduating, firstly, it's not a foregone conclusion that you are going to get a job. And secondly, the nature of that job may not allow you to pay as much as is required for you to refund this. So I do think that when we do the calculations, looking at the current existing students, NSFAS claims to be funding about 70%. So we're talking about 30% remaining out of the enrolled. So out of those, there will be the missing middle together with those students who are funded by external stakeholders and those who are funded by parents. So within that mix of about 30%, we expect that the missing middle will be a component of those. But let's not assume that just because a student within the missing middle then has to have this loan. This is one of the solutions among a comprehensive way of looking at this. Let's try and get as much bursary funding as possible, particularly from other sources other than government.
I think that question of, providing alternative ways of making sure that we support the students in order to manage the financial burden is a very important one, and I'd like to explore it with the SETAs a bit later on. But Vincent, I would like to come back to you now at this point. So obviously, since 2017, perhaps the issues relating to the question of access have been addressed somewhat by the fact that many more students were now given access onto the financial aid scheme when it moved from 122,000 to 350,000 Rand. But I imagine that in spite of that, there have still been funding constraints where universities have a lot of applicants that say, I'd like to get into this institution. I do not qualify for that particular funding agency because of my family income, and yet I do not have any other options. How has UCT dealt with this in the past few years in relation to providing access for qualifying and good students to be able to access the University of Cape Town?
Thank you, Kaya. And in your opening remarks, and even now, you still speak about the missing middle, and you've explained, how do we define that and what are the limitations in terms of how one thinks about how that threshold of 600,000 hasn't changed. At the University of Cape Town and many others within the sector, what we have done in 2015, following Fees Must Fall, is that we introduced what we call gap funding. That gap funding really provides financial aid to the missing middle students. And in 2023 at UCT, that allocation got into 100 million rands to be allotted to students. That's one of the ways that we're looking at addressing the funding shortfall within the sector. The other ways that we're doing at the University of Cape Town is that we are collaborating with financial institutions. The way we do it is that we negotiate loans, and as much as that's not in the desired form, but it's a form of a solution in terms of where as a country we find ourselves, and understanding that universities have limited resources and need to function effectively to provide quality education. What we do at UCT with a financial institution is that we've negotiated with them favorable terms in a way that, for instance, the interest that they would charge to students is the interest that they would incur themselves from acquiring those funds, and not necessarily to make loans for them. The other thing that has been impediment with regards to student loan is having to look at surety that a student would have to provide, and therefore being excluded in that process. So that's the other area. We also are leveraging on another partnerships with private sectors. And that has enabled us in the previous period to raise an amount of just over 5 million. And that was dedicated specifically to clear student debt, because we have to find alternative ways over and above what the government is providing us. At UCT, what we do in addition, especially for our returning students, because returning students would incur debt, and therefore, as a result of that, find it difficult to come back and enroll at the university. And largely, it's the cohort of students that we're referring to now, is we have what we call a grace period or a debts appeal. What that does is that it allows a student to apply for flexible payment option and consider appeals for financial assistance. And in that cohort, you'd sometimes also find a student who previously was not eligible for NSFAS due to those constraints in terms of NSFAS funding and who NSFAS can provide funding to. If I look at our data at UCT, as of last year, 62% of students who came and applied for a grace period were successful. We're still looking at that number for 2024 because we are busy with that process. Kai also touched in terms of, it's another thing to provide all these forms of funding for the missing middle, but it's not only tuition fee that we're dealing with here, it's also accommodation. And at UCT, we provide accommodation support. And the way we do it is that we do negotiate with our off-campus service providers to accommodate students without requiring the usual upfront deposits, because they can't afford, as you would imagine. So we're able to enter into that and use our influence as UCT to provide that. That also is provided for emergency accommodation to some students, despite the amount of debts that they may be owing at the university. In addition, Kaya, what we're looking at as a university, and it's been ongoing process, it's to look at our policies and think of a policy reform. And really, it's to think about, as you've said, if you look at that cap of 600,000 for a household earning, it hasn't changed for a number of years. And we're thinking if you have to factor in inflation, time value of money, as we think about our policies, how do our policies as well as a university move on with times to be able to support students adequately and allow access to education. So those are some of the efforts that as a university we are continuously working on. And as you've heard, it's in collaboration with different stakeholders, and the university in itself, being financially constrained, has to leverage on that. And we've mentioned how ISVAP has been a valuable member, and then we need to replicate more of ISVAP and think about different ways. And one of the ways that we are thinking about as a university as well is to think about building an endowment, because what we have found is that, borrowing money or asking donation every year and only to utilize it, it's not sustainable for any form. That's where we find ourselves having to provide the loan forms. But if as a country we can build an endowment fund that will allow us specifically to address tuition fees and fee debt of students and use the return for that to fund, that's one of the solutions. It will take time, require some patience into it, and require a collective of efforts, and not only private sectors, but also us as individuals being able to give to this fund to enable access to higher education, Kaya.
Thanks for that, Vincent. In relation to the partnerships and the collaboration with financial institutions, I imagine that if individual students will go to banks and try and negotiate, their capacity to bargain for favorable rates is severely limited. And when an institution comes and says that, look, we are going to vouch for the fact that as an institution, we believe that this person stands a good chance of succeeding and getting that degree and therefore being able to repay their loan. So therefore, please consider a favorable loan regime for them. I imagine that helps many more students to be able to access accessible funding. But I suspect that it's probably still a once-off exercise that UCT does rather than a universal practice across the sector at large. From the lessons that you've picked up as UCT, firstly, are these conversations easy to initiate with financial institutions? does this create a particular obligation on the university to then say, well, actually, the students that we recommend, for example, are people who are probably going to stand a good chance of repaying the loans? How do those interactions work in order to ensure that students can actually benefit from those concessionary loans?
And Kaya, what you're saying is that because we're coming in as a university and we're putting forward such students, although they do apply in their own private capacity, is that as a university, we serve as a risk mitigation with a financial institution. There has been an appetite, and I know it's not only us, UCT, there are other institutions who also are applying the same models. There's a number of financial institutions who are approaching us in this regard and to be able to do it. We first implemented it in 2023, and what we want to do is to really measure it over a period of time and actually measure the success of the students over a period of time and see towards graduation. Because the other issue is that with financial constraints that students have, it does affect on the academic success. So we understand as a university that we have a responsibility not only to provide this quality education, but how do we ensure that a student is able to succeed within a reasonable time of being at a university? Because even when they stay here much longer, they accumulate more debt, and you would not want to do that. So we're very comfortable as a university being advocates for students, as it were, and speaking on behalf of the financial institutions. And we encourage those that haven't approached us as yet. I know we're still speaking to some to reach out to us and see how they can be part of the ecosystem in providing the solution of funding in this country.
Thank you very much for that, Vincent. Disa, I want to come to you now. Obviously, the Manufacturing and Engineering SETA is a very critical sectoral education and training authority, mainly because, the country needs as many engineers as possible. But I think what we've also seen is that process of ensuring that universities do indeed bring that pipeline of the skills that we need in order to run this economy is not always a linear process. And one of the problems may well be that SETA is able to look at the country's national skills plan and then say, we need 30,000 engineers of this particular type, only to find that universities don't have enough, mainly because a lot of them don't have the capacity to finance their way through higher education. Now, of course, that means that you guys would then initiate programs that trying to assist as many students as you can. But again, every institution has got resource limitations. So this development that then sort of seeks to break the question of financial access in relation to students that are trapped in that missing middle, is this something that you as a SETA see as a positive development that will enable many more students to access the system, to grow the pipeline of potential engineers, and to be able to enable you as a SETA to say, look, actually things are happening?
Good afternoon, Kaya. Good afternoon to the entire audience. Thank you for the invitation from ISFEP. I'm happy to actually say, Kaya, that SETA actually entered the chat before the WhatsApp group was even created on the conversation of the missing middle. So in 2023, the board, we had a board meeting at SETA, and the board was like, there's such a need in the country. Instead of us trying to motivate to National Treasury why we should return our surplus funds, why don't we look at possibly funding all these missing middle? The term at the time was not the missing middle. The term was, we have a huge load of student debt. So management, we were given the go-ahead to see what we can do. So we put the entire team together to see what we could do. And it's amazing, Kaya, what SETA has done in the last 12 months. We contacted NSFAS, and we asked them to submit a proposal to us. But with them, we were specific, and we asked them to submit a proposal regarding the missing middle, because we knew at the time that this is a group that has been neglected. And personally, I come from that group. In fact, I come from not the missing middle, where I was born into a poor family. I actually went to UCT. So I know the challenges of going to the student financial office every day to check whether you've received student funding. So it was when we're given that go ahead to do that as management, it was not only personal for me, but it was something that I think as a SETA we're excited about to give back to the communities. So we have already signed with NSFAS about 140 million rands in the last financial year to fund 300 missing middle students. The number in the contract will say 300, but we know some courses, because we're using the threshold of 180,000 per student, but we know that some students will not use that money, will not use the entire amount. So we're possibly looking at about 500 that will benefit from the loan alone, from the grant alone that we took to NSFAS last year. We didn't only do that. What we did is we went to different provincial governments. And what we did is we said to them, look at your universities and ask them to submit to you the loans, student debts, that students that cannot receive their certificates because they owe the universities. And I think that's what Dr. Matutu was referring to, that most of the students are, some of them who have already finished their university qualifications are stuck at home because they don't have access to their qualifications. So we reached out to them, and part of the initiatives that we did in the last financial year was to make sure that we fund as many students as we could possibly, as much as possible, whatever was submitted to us. But we were focusing on our sector, of course. And I think in your introduction, you were speaking so much about skills that are relating to our sector. So what is key to us, is key to us at this point is we know that most of the scarce skills are in our sector. And what we did with the universities, we asked that they send us a list of students that cannot access the job market because they've got these certificates that have been withheld, and so that they can access the job market. And I think the CFO, Dr. Mutolo, spoke about this threshold that I think needs to be revised, because in my view, there's no difference really between someone who earns 350,000 and someone who earns 351,000. If you think about it, if my combined income is 351,000, then I must fall into this category of the missing middle, and I'll possibly get half a loan, half a grant, if I'm successful. But you've got this group, this group that has a threshold of 350,000 that will qualify for the full grant or bursary. So I think it's also something that we need to look at, but at least this is a start. If you're looking at the current missing middle, up to 600,000, that's what we have, then that's what we must work with. As SETA, we are committed, Kaya, we are very committed to continue continue giving grants to NSFAS. In fact, we've had a contract with ISFEP. We've had a contract with ISFEP in the last, very successfully, to give out bursaries to not just the missing middle, to a number of young people. So we are committed, and we also want to say, the contribution that we need to make. Private sector engagement is very key, because one, we could discuss in terms of how they could contribute to the funding, but also their commitment into absorbing these young people once they've received these qualifications. So I know that, for example, when we went to the Free State, when they were giving out when they were clearing out student debts, they also invited the private sector, and they said to them, now they've got the qualifications, employ them. Now imagine those young people, now they've got debts, they've got a loan that they have to carry. How will they service that loan? And it's a huge challenge with a poor economy. So what I'm trying to say, Kaya, is all hands must be on deck. It's not a higher education problem. It's everybody's problem to try and see how we can support our young people. And it also talks to how we can also restructure our curricula, so that when they are at a young age, they also choose, right, degrees or qualifications that will make them employable, or that will encourage them to be entrepreneurs. So you get a lot of young people, they get university access, they get into the university, but even if they qualify, they're sitting at home. Now they can't contribute positively to the economy. It creates a problem that multiplies and multiplies. So in my view, it's a cradle to grave approach that we need to look at as a country in terms of how we solve this problem. So I think that's the contribution that I have for now. But as Mayor SETA, that's why I started the conversation with, we entered the chat before the chat group was even opened about the missing middle. And I know that we're going to have soon, going to be having conversations with the department and with NSFAS in terms of how we can continue with the grant that we give them. And I know that Dr. Matutu was worried about the sustainability, which should worry us all, because can MESITA do this continuously? Can MESITA have the funds to continually give funding to students, the missing middle? So how do we ensure that the pocket at MESITA never runs dry? And how do we also get the buy-in of industry? When we go to industry and we go to account and we say to them, this is how we've used these funds, how do we encourage them to keep on participating by paying levies in the sector and making sure that they absorb these young people when they qualify?
All right, no, thank you very much for those reflections, Tessa. And I think obviously the fact that you entered the chat long before many of us knew that there was a chat to begin with means that you've gathered the type of insights that probably will be necessary as the system is rolled out and people want to be able to understand how the growing pains are to be managed. Robin, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. I know you and I have worked with the BASA structures where we've become very familiar with the type of issues that affect and impact on student performance and their capacity to transition through higher education. And of course, now you're in the SETA space where you now get to see a bird's eye view of why it's important for us to continue developing skills that are fit for purpose, that are fit for the current world of work. And I think obviously when you then look at the missing middle students, when they were unfunded, there's always a risk that South Africa isn't tapping into its human capacity potential simply because there are people that should be in the system but cannot get into the system because they are underfunded. This development, does it then address some of those key issues relating to the pipeline of the skills development for the country?
Hi, Kaya. Yes, it's nice to see you again after the past life that we had together in the different structures. And good afternoon to all your members and to those from ISFAP, to everyone here on the webinar. So for us, we definitely saw this as an opportunity from an access perspective. What we definitely see, look, we work in the energy and water space, and similar to MESITA, we see really enormous skills gap in the engineering space and so forth that feeds into the skills needs within our sector. And in our industries, in energy and water, those skills needs right now are particularly pertinent. So, you know, we complain, we know very much about our energy security challenges, and I don't think we even talk enough about our water challenges. And one of the things we've definitely observed is that so, I mean, there's challenges right across the space, right? There's from the throughput of learners who even qualify to study the relevant programs at university level, the quality of those learners, which is what we potentially inherit from the basic education system. That's where the challenges start, and they're right across the board. So funding is an aspect of that. And what I love about the model that's been presented by the minister is as long as we address the sustainability challenges, as one of the speakers also spoke about earlier on, it definitely creates more funding within the system that will help to address our challenges. So the access issue, like I said, there's a myriad of challenges that lead to access issue. Financial is one of them, but also if you look at the university space, we don't have that many universities in the country. I believe we should have around 25 or 27. And the reality is that universities are also limited in their capacity to be able to offer to offer space, for the skills needs to be filled within our country. And something, as far as I understood the loan scheme, it then also applies to TVET colleges, which for me is great. We know that we've got challenges within that space, challenges that we are all working to address. DISA from SETA also would be very familiar with how we are working towards capacitating that space. But from an access perspective, it's also very important to frame the conversation as one that is applicable to universities, but also to TVET learners, understanding that coming out of matric, not everyone has the necessary level of pass or even marks to get into those university programs, but there's various ways to, for example, become an engineer at the end of the day. Now, if we look at sustainability, what is envisioned by the loan scheme, of course, is that once learners qualify and once they start working, they would be starting to repay some of that loan back. And as much as we know that having a loan is a burden coming into the working world, for me personally, if I look back on my journey, I was fortunate enough to receive bursary funding, but I was willing to take a loan because I understood what a university education would have meant for the rest of my life and career. And many of us on the call, I actually recognize a lot of the names on the call, and I know that life trajectory of many of us would have been impacted by that issue of just access. So what the scheme allows is for us to come in other ways. The things that DISA from SETA mentioned is, some of the ways in which us as SETAs try to support the system. And again, if we've got ourselves as government, we've got this loan scheme, we've got private sector, it creates more opportunities for students who want to enter the system. I think in as much as there's limitations in the spaces in universities and TVET colleges, it shouldn't be that anyone who gets in shouldn't be able to continue and complete because of the issue of funding. So it allows us to become more creative to say, how do we perhaps refocus some of the funding that we already provide just towards student debt so that learners can get their qualifications? How do we allocate it towards some of the other peripheral issues, peripheral needs of students? I'm calling them peripheral, but they're really not. You need to have a comfortable place to stay that's not too far from campus, that's conducive to your learning. You need certain tools and that sort of thing to be able to make a success of your studies. And so this scheme allows all of us to focus our energy more broadly on the entire package of support that a student needs in order to succeed and to complete their qualifications and then to successfully enter the workplace.
No, thank you very much for that, Robin. And I think obviously the question of making sure that it remains viable is going to be the litmus test for how successful it is. Dr. Matutu, I want to come back to you now with the question of viability. Now, we do know, given our long involvement in higher education, that one of the biggest problems that has always been associated with the old NSFAS loan scheme was the simple fact that far too many students quite simply never made it towards the end of their journeys. We saw the high attrition rates across first year and the very low throughput and graduation rates, which meant that a lot of the funded students quite simply were never in a position to earn an income in order to be able to pay those loans. And I think it's become very clear over time that in order to be able to correct that anomaly, universities and university systems need to be able to provide more comprehensive support for students in order to maximize their chances of actually succeeding. From what I've seen, it looks like some universities have got very good support programs that seem to acknowledge that reality, but it still doesn't seem to be a universal practice to say, if students come from this particular quintile, we understand that contextually their exposure to this particular elements of the curriculum were structured in such a manner in order for them to succeed at university, this is the additional support that will be required in order to get them across the line. And I think in the absence of that holistic understanding of what the contextual issues are, we still are running the risk that, best intentions notwithstanding, we have a loan system and far too many students quite simply never make it across the line, which means that the viability of the loan system will itself be under threat. What are Yusuf's reflections on the question of how we ensure that the viability of the system is not threatened by the possibility of students quite simply never making it across the line?
I think there are two questions in this question, Kaya. But before we get into the questions you are asking, let me just clarify this thing of universities withholding certificates. So as University South Africa, we did intervene and we did explain that while withdrawing withholding the parchment, the potential employers should be provided with a transcript which explains that the student has completed their qualification, and where necessary, then there can be an explanation of the performance throughout the degree qualification. And all universities have adhered to that. Where this becomes a problem is when a student wants to proceed with their studies within an institution. So if you've got, let's say, your first degree, then you are not allowed to go on to your honors or to your master's or to your PhD, which becomes a problem. That is withholding people from proceeding with their academic studies. Otherwise, as for employment, the employers do get that explanation. And also, it's quite a hassle each time you've been shortlisted. You have to go to the university and explain to them that, can you please send something to the effect that I've completed my qualification to this potential employer, which they do. On the issue of success within the higher education sector, there are quite a number of factors. What has been identified as an impediment is this issue of partial funding. So what we have found previously is that some bursaries would offer a funding which is not full funding. So in that case, what we have observed is that once the student gets fully funded, there is a higher degree of success than them not being partially funded. That's point number one. So alleviating the whole burden of funding by providing full funding is quite a crucial one. And we have seen it, and there's evidence to it. NSFAS has proven it as well. Once it started fully funding students, and the success was much higher than students which were partially funded, or the rest of the students. The other aspect now comes to the psychosocial support and also the academic support of students. There's a lot of progress which has been made insofar as academic support. We've got extended programs at most universities, particularly in these scarce skills areas. And now there's the psychosocial support initiatives such as ISFAP are influencing the higher education sector broadly in terms of the kind of support that they provide to the system. You'll find an engineering student saying that I'm doing a finance course or personal finance course, which will be counted towards my degree qualification. So these things have just started now coming in, but when it comes to the academic support, universities have been working for a very long time on it. As early as in the early 90s, already there was academic development program within institutions such as University of Cape Town, Stellenbosch University. We used to work in such programs in my area, which is mathematics in particular. So there's a lot of support in that area. But when it comes now to issues of IT and so on, the programs such as ISFAP as well have led the way in terms of supporting students with these laptops. And then COVID, of course, came, and then they eradicated the whole thing of that it's possible to have a student without a laptop. Now all students are supported through laptop funding, be it by NSFAS, be it by their institutions or their bursaries. It's considered to be a necessity to have a laptop. Previously, it was not. So what I'm saying is that as time goes on, some of these things which are initiated and which are proven by other stakeholders are absorbed and institutionalized by universities. Thanks.
Yeah, Dr. Matutu, and I think obviously, you know, some of the references that you refer to, University of Stellenbosch, for example, I know UCT used to have the Education Development Unit, and other universities have also implemented programs of that nature. It is quite clear that there is indeed a responsibility that universities inherit once they bring students onto their ambit, and that is the responsibility to ensure that as many of the support structures are put together as possible. Now, one of the challenges that emerged even during COVID was that students who were funded either through NSFAS or through other schemes were the ones that would then say to their particular sponsor, to their particular funder, my university now says I need to have a laptop, so therefore that forms part of the cost of study. But many students who didn't have access to those particular funding agencies still found that to be a new struggle, an additional struggle that then meant that essentially their chances of success were even more curtailed than before. From University of South Africa, do you see that from the universities there's been perhaps a shift towards understanding what it really means to have comprehensive support rather than it being a question of a few case studies across the system? And does that understanding then translate to perhaps an improvement in the graduation rates across the system at large?
Certainly, universities have identified this, and with the support of government, they've been able to provide, for instance, the laptop for some students, besides your NSFAS. I'm talking about now working with DHET and working with some private providers in order to do so. And similarly, when it comes to the subsidies for these extended programs and so on, all of those things are taken into account. So they've become part of the institutional culture now. You know that there are a certain group of students which are considered to qualify, to be talented. However, there's a gap which needs to be closed. And it has been proven that by the time they hit the finishing line, you find out that they are among the top students who get selected at postgraduate level. So there has been adequate research in this area to show that, because it has been on for a very long time. So it becomes part of the institutions with the support of government and the private sectors sometimes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Vincent, I mean, when we talk about the viability question, I remember in particular that UCT had some very good comprehensive academic support programs that enabled students that were entering into the commerce fields, for example, to essentially be onboarded onto the academic pathway and to essentially minimize the casualties. And I think obviously the fact that such a system existed meant that UCT could then say, look, as soon as people got here, we gave them the best chance of succeeding in higher education. And that, of course, meant that those are the students that eventually were able to find jobs, and should loans be the way in which they funded their way through it, would be in a position to sort of pay them off. What lessons can you share about how UCT has actually identified the need for academic support programs and how those link onto the viability of financing higher education? Because in the absence of such support programs, you get throughput rates that are low, you get high attrition rates, and you suddenly see a viability problem for the financing of the system at large.
And Kaya, you're right. I mean, it's of our interest as a university that students who come through to our university ultimately become successful. And we have a number of initiatives, even in our health sciences faculty, key to those, and we want to replicate those across all faculties. One thing that we have found quite useful, and I'll start with our students that you find in residences, is that, and Robin touched on this, to say, you know, when we think about what would enable the student to be successful, it's more than it's more than just providing a desk, a chair, and a bag for students to to be in that environment. What is very key is that we provide an environment that's conducive. And that in itself, it would mean there'll be some mentorship that's being provided to students. We provide an environment that provides a reliable internet, Kaya, reliable electricity. And all these things, of course, come at a cost, and the cost needs to be funded somehow, although one would want to keep the cost base at a minimum. But given the nature of the environment, the challenges that we face, and we are still being interested to increase student success, is that it requires all these things. Being involved in extramural activities at our universities, we found that the students who are participating in such activities actually do become successful. Existing in a community where they feel safe. As a university, we have an open campus, but it's quite important for us that we provide campus security, as it were, that enables that our students also feel safe and are not threatened in any way. Kaya, one thing that we really touched on and which is very key is that student success is not going to be attained if we put more pressure on students, and that pressure being a financial one. So the other initiatives that we do that one might not think it's direct, it's that having to provide that support. Actually, what we do as a university is that monitoring student success on a continuous basis becomes quite key, because then we are able to pick up students who are at a risk of not being successful, and then being able to divert and provide them some form of supports, that is specific and dedicated to them. We have an office at the university dedicated to that, where it addresses other issues that students may be confronted with. It's an office of inclusivity, and that office is dedicated to any other emotional and social issues that students may have, and can approach that office, and we're able to provide that support. We think we can do more, and academics are continually looking at ways in where we can do more and ensure student success, because with the caliber of students that we have, we believe that our throughput rate should be at the maximum.
Yeah. Now, Vincent, the university system is made up of a wide range of universities. You started working at a university with over 400,000 students with UNISA. Now you deal with a much smaller audience. And I think, obviously, it is probably not always practical for institutions to have sufficient resources to be able to have a granular understanding of what the issues that the students are facing are, and also what type of support systems they need to have. But what we've also seen is that institutions like ISFAB, for example, or even Tutuga, are in a position to essentially start engaging with students long before they get to university, and then be able to identify some of the key contextual issues that may impact on their performance at university, so that by the time they start, there is already a level of awareness about what the key issues that might need to be, that might impact on performance, and then to start putting together some support structures in order to address that. But that seems to be still a small, a smaller process rather than a universal one. Does the ability of those institutions like ISFAB to be able to provide some of those insights and feed them into the university system, does that then help universities have a much better understanding of the type of cohort and the type of students that they're dealing with, in order to then pitch their support systems at the right level?
Yeah, and Kai, you're right, it's all collaborative. It's not working in isolation, and we appreciate whichever insight we receive, the one that ISFAB gives us, and any other partners that are associated with us as a university. And we do look at ways on how then we can tailor-make the support that we provide to our students to ensure success. So definitely the insights that we get in whichever form and through our academics as well, we're able to tailor it in a way that it shows student success. There's still a challenge, Kaya, within the sector, and largely part of it is that it's attributed to the period where we had a huge cohort of students over the 2 years of COVID or so that were in the system, and how that has impacted on their success as well. And trying to remedy that, we still see the effects of it. And that's why we're also seeing that the pass rates somewhat in comparison to other years are not great. But we believe in the last 2 years or so, the cohort that we have had and having gone through our full system as a residence university should perform much better. So there's all these nuances in terms of when one think about where we find ourselves as a country in terms of throughputs and throughputs not being ideal, what are the factors that have attributed to that. And the insights that we have received during that time, and we continually have this discussion as a contact university to say, if COVID did anything else, it proved to us that there is a place for a contact university such as ours, and for the type of student that we attract and for the type of support that we would like to provide to them.
Thank you for that, Vincent. Disa, what we heard from you earlier on is the fact that SETA has a long established relationship with NSFAS in order to be able to see what type of support you can provide to the higher education system. Now, of course, unfortunately, for all its pains, NSFAS does have particular reputational issues, which means that a lot of people are still very skeptical about its capacity to not only administer its core mandate, which is, the provision of finance to students below the 350,000 threshold, but also then the question of how it will add an additional obligation and how effectively it will run it. Now, given the fact that SETA has already worked with NSFAS and has probably identified what some of the key challenges are and how those challenges can be addressed in order to ensure that ultimately the students benefit, what type of insights would you then share with other stakeholders who are then looking at this new opportunity to collaborate and assist in funding of the previously missing middle students, and then say, well, actually, we still think that NSFAS, given its role, its centrality in the system, is still a very good platform or reference structure to be able to get insights into where the needs are, where the funding gaps are, but we have particular anxieties about engaging with them, given how their systems have created issues in the past. From SETA, how have you attacked or how have you approached some of those issues relating to that collaboration in order to ensure that students ultimately get assistance?
Thank you, Kaya. That's a very good question, and especially with this reputational conversations that are happening around NSFAS. But this is something that we've always had confidence as SETA, because our contract with NSFAS is evidence-based. So just like all other MOAs we sign with our stakeholders, is that before we release any money, right, we require certain requirements. We ask for certain requirements. It's the same with NSFAS. When we signed the contract with them and the SLA, we were clear that in the SLA, the kind of evidence we will require before we release the funds. And I'm happy to say that they have already submitted that kind of evidence. And in fact, yesterday or two days ago, we released some money to pay some of that, to pay to NSFAS, about 11 million to pay for the missing middle students. So I think to anyone listening and to worried about whether the money will be effective, that would be used for what it's intended for. As SETA, we have not had problems with that. ISFEP is here as well. They know how we require, because in some instances, we would literally not even pay if we don't get the evidence, because the evidence is predetermined. If the SLA is saying there must be evidence of this young person is registering a course in the sector that will address our sector skills needs, that they are in the missing middle gap. So that's the kind of evidence that we look at before we pay the money. So I would encourage people, stakeholders who are listening, to get into it, because there is a need. But the strength of it will be in the SLA, will be in the contract, to ensure that all funds are dispersed based on deliverables agreed upfront between the stakeholder and NSFAS.
Yeah, and I think obviously historically the model always used to involve students and universities and NSFAS. It was a three-way relationship. It had its own challenges. we've now moved on to a system that says that, look, it's simply a relationship between NSFAS and the student, and the universities are sort of in a transitory, peripheral element rather. And of course, a lot of people have said that that also creates and brings new challenges on its own, in that students may arrive at university not knowing whether they're funded. Universities don't know whether students are indeed funded. And that simply means that you then have to tap into NSFAS and try and figure out what the status of the funding is. And those are the type of challenges that we've seen before. Now, it's also quite important to then figure out whether it is indeed necessary to then have some support structures at the institutional level that then enable students to be able to get the answers, the responses onto their funding status much faster than what is currently the case. Is this something that perhaps can assist in ensuring that there's a more seamless coordination across the system? Because NSFAS is based in Cape Town, universities are based everywhere else, and those interaction points create more frustrations for students than anyone else.
Well, when we were signing that contract, the CEO of NSFAS, the ex-CEO, Mr. Nongogo, came to our offices, and that is the question that was raised in terms of how do we best support? Because you see, SETA doesn't come when a student receives, or when a learner receives money from NSFAS, it won't say this money is from SETA. So we don't necessarily know the challenges unless we see about them in the paper. And we won't say this particular student was funded by a SETA fund. So it is a question that we pose to them, that they need to ensure that when the funds, when the funds are made available, they must be paid. And when we were doing this drive with the different radio stations, I know at YFM, they asked, why doesn't SETA go and make sure that there's support at the university level as well? And because we don't give directly to the universities, it's challenging for us. So I think maybe what NSFAS can look into is possibly, I'm not sure whether they're looking at different offices, because I know from a personal experience, I've got a cousin whose daughter had challenges. In fact, she was almost kicked out of university because it wasn't paid and they just didn't know who to call. So possibly more visibility, so that young people, they're not just stuck on an email or a phone call. They can go to an office where they can get more assistance. But from the SETA side, that's something we'd definitely support if they were to do that, because it also means that our funds are getting dispersed in time. So what we also do is, our contract is specific. The one that we have now is for 3 years. And we are hoping that if things go well, it means that all those funds must be dispersed within the 3 years. So if the contract goes over, it means something went wrong somewhere. And in some instances where we've had contracts with them, this was not the first one. We've had to close out those projects because we were not getting the evidence, not because the money didn't go anywhere. It's just that the funds were not dispersed in time. So I think they should possibly look into more visibility. I'm not sure what their strategy is, but it is also something that we had raised with the ex-CEO, that as much as we are giving this money, we really want it to get to the people who need it the most. And when they have a question, they must be able to get that access and find out what they should do.
No, thank you very much for that. Robin, I'm going to come to you before I open the floor to our audience to engage. I think one of the key questions that has always, dribbled people in the higher education space is whether institutions like SETAs, who have an intimate understanding of what the workplace requires and who also have very strong relationships with universities, should then be in a position to identify the type of additional non-academic skills that should be cultivated at the university level in order to ensure that when students succeed at university, not only do they succeed in the education dimension, but they're also able to thrive in the workplace. And I think when we start talking about some of the comprehensive supports that we've seen by institutions like ISFAB, institutions like Allen Gray, and institutions like SAICA, it seems to already have that long-term view of saying, well, not only do we want them to transition out of higher education, but we also want them to transition seamlessly into the workplace. And that seems that in relation to SETAs, that remains an element which can be scaled up in order to ensure that actually, when your levy payers say, well, actually, our levy money funded higher education, but we then have this burden of then having to reskill and reteach, how can we do that better? Is this something that SETA should perhaps be considering in order to ensure that the students that now access the system are actually able to transition seamlessly from the world of education into the world of learning, world of work?
Absolutely, Kaya. So it's definitely something that us as SETAs, if we were not awake and alive to it before, it's certainly the feedback that we are receiving right now from across the board for the past few years. And I think potentially, especially COVID, really brought that issue to the fore when you had a cohort of learners and students who had experienced their learning in a different way and were then at some point expected to transition into a workplace and work under completely different conditions, you know, after high school. So it's definitely not, is it something that we should do? It's definitely something we should do, but it's something that all of the SETAs are working on. So Disa mentioned earlier on, was it Disa? I'm not sure now, but how we incorporate, for example, entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial learning or entrepreneurial thinking into our qualifications and learning programs. And I think to add on to that, so we've looked, you know, across the board at what are the extra add-ons when you produce an engineer, when you capacitate an engineer. There's a technical element, and I'm only using engineers as an example, but in all fields, there's a technical element, there's a critical knowledge base that you need to have. But teaching and learning needs to expand beyond that technical knowledge base into a lot of other areas. Entrepreneurship is one of them. Work readiness is how we've coined it, is one of the others that's very quickly emerging as critical. Digital skills, digital knowledge, understanding, acumen, literacy even is also one of the skills. So there's those skills like across the board that apply everywhere to different extents, and it's definitely something that we concern ourselves with. How have we addressed it? You've actually touched on it. So it is incumbent on SETAs when you look at what establishes us and very much guides how we work. It's the National Skills Development Plan of 2030. It gives very clear mandate on what SETAs are supposed to do and how we are supposed to approach it. And one of the things that it calls on us to do is to be very closely linked with industry. And yes, there's the levy payers that you've alluded to, but you've also alluded to industry associations who give us that feedback and that insight as to in our specific industry. So there's 21 SETAs and we also have different industries. Within those particular industries, it's really incumbent upon us to engage very closely with individual employers and also with industry associations to understand what those work readiness skills are, but also how do we frame the entrepreneurial spirit that is required within that particular industry based on where it is in its life cycle, for example. What are the relevant digital skills, etc. So that's something that we do. All of the SETAs do it to different extents. And while we very much employ a partnership model, we've spoken a lot about how all of us as different institutions, even on this panel, are partnered up with other institutions and with one another as well. And the partnerships are not just about seeing, you know, what we can do in terms of implementation, but it's also about gaining research, gaining insight, gaining knowledge about specifically those areas of what is really required in the workplace. One other thing that we also advocate for very strongly within our industry, the energy and water industries, is this is not a one-way thing. So it can't be that the higher education system just receives information from the industry about what type of other skills it needs. Let's call it workplace readiness. What types of other skills do they need, and expect that they're going to receive a perfectly packaged and refined product being a graduate at the end of the day. There's a very big responsibility on us in the workplace to assist with that transition and that movement from the learning environment into the work environment. It is important in the work environment that we create the similar structures of support, although they would look different, but some of the principles that we've spoken about earlier in terms of that psychosocial support, the mentorship support, whatever it might be, that we formalize and create that within industry and within our workplaces, and also our industry associations. We've mentioned SETA, so we know SETA, for example, which is the professional body for accountants, or one of the professional bodies, has an active mentorship scheme. I can't recall if they focus it specifically on women or if it's across the board. It might be actually across the board, but a mentorship scheme within an industry association becomes very important as well, because it assists with that transition into becoming a really capable employee if you're going to be an employee, or a capable business owner if that's what you're going to do. And these are the types of things that we also require from industry. We require it from industry associations, from industry in terms of the businesses. And it's also something that one needs to take up on a personal level as well, right? You know, again, with my accounting background, you come from the big four accounting firms, and the firms will put nice things in place. They will be well packaged, nicely promoted. They'll have their own logo, whatever it is, like a mentorship scheme. But it's incumbent upon me and us who are in the school to then say, I put up my hand to be a mentor, whether it's to one or two people. It's incumbent on all of us as well. So I just want to say that, to highlight that it's a two-way street, and that, again, the input is required from all of us across the board. And I want to believe, I know at EWC we do take this into account. And I want to believe, I'm quite sure that across the SETAs it happens. And it's something that we have started formally codifying into our qualifications. So we don't develop degrees, but below the degree level, we develop qualifications in the form of learnerships and skills programs, and we have started very clearly embedding outcomes, unit standards, credits related to workplace readiness, related to digital skills, related to entrepreneurial skills, because we are just realizing the technical is not necessarily the name of the game. And we rely heavily on industry to give us that input as well.
No, thank you very much for that, Robin. I'd like to then ask our audience members, if you have a question, you can just put it on the chat box, and then we'll get some of our panelists to address it. But before then, I'd like to invite Morne to give us some of the insights onto how ISFAP essentially identifies the type of support programs or support structures that are necessary in order to enable its funded students to thrive in higher education. From the annual reports that I've seen, there is indeed a remarkably high success rate for ISFAP-funded students across the entire higher education ecosystem. It is clearly something that needs to be replicated across institutions and across different organizations. Can you just share with us, Morne, some of the key lessons that ISFAP has learned since its formation that you then apply in order to ensure that you maximize the chances of success for funded students?
Thanks, Kaya. You're putting me on the spot, but no problem. Great to join, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for our great panelists joining us today. I think from ISFAP's point of view, we've always believed that the real key to success, whether it be the funding comes from a loan source or from a full bursary source, we've always believed that a very, very important element of the success of such a program and the sustainability is actually to provide those students with a comprehensive model of support that really holds their hand from the day that they apply right through to the day that they graduate, and actually way beyond that. You know, they become our alumni. We help them to find jobs. We help ensure they become economic contributors to the country. And this system that we call wraparound support is really the pride and the joy of ISFAP, and we've been we've been tinkering with it and improving it and changing it all the time. You know, during COVID, we had to make significant changes to the way that we support students. But at the end of the day, what we are talking about here is We are talking about often students that come from poor and missing middle households that are the first in the family to go to university. We must never forget that. And there is no frame of reference. They arrive there with Vincent, you know, at UCT, really, and I'm saying this respectfully, but like a deer in the headlights, you know, in terms of not knowing what to expect, where to go, how to get help, and how to be successful as a student. And that's where our system of support comes in, really everything from, you know, obviously, and I think it was Dr. Petiwe that said full cost of study support, very important. We don't want a student to be hungry and expect them to perform at university. We want them to be fully funded and have all the support they need financially. That's taking the first burden away. Then comes the rest of the support, which we call that ecosystem of support, or the wraparound support, which includes everything from making sure their allowances are paid on time every month. And I think you raised this concern in one of your questions. Everything related to mental health, psychosocial support, everything related to workplace readiness, study skills, stress management, you know, things related to them being able to know where to go in the university if they need help. Where do they go if there's an issue with their accommodation, if there's an issue with their laptop that we've provided to them? If there's an issue with connectivity in their private residence, where do they go? Yes, they can go to the landlord, but are they going to be heard? Or will they be better heard when a call comes from ISFAP saying, hey, we've got 20 or 30 students in that residence, you know, we really want you to take care of this issue. So it really is a comprehensive system of support. And when you talked about the expansion of this system and universities going much more boots and all into this, I was so excited because there's a lot of work being done at the moment at various of our big universities about a student support infrastructure. And we would like to believe that we have planted that seed together with the likes, the early frontiers like Tutuka, you know. We have hopefully helped to plant those seeds that we need to create this structure for students to feel supported and to feel loved and feel part of a family where they have also a community. You know, ISFAP students form a community within that campus. And that's part of that support structure, to get together with mentors, additional tutors where they need it, etc. It really goes all the way. And yes, there's a cost to that support, but we believe that that cost is a fraction of what it costs if you actually have that student dropping out, failing, not progressing in time. And what we want to see is to cut so much of that wastage out of the system, whereby we have students failing, dropping out, not finishing in record time. If we can reduce all of that wastage and invest some of that money into this support structure, then I think we've got a winning formula. And I want to say it's not only for students that's bursary funded. It should be for all students. And it should in particularly be for students that have student loans. And we've been working with the banks, the big banks. As you know, Banking Association is one of our founding members. We've been working with BASA and with the big banks to say, let us support students that's on your loan books as well, because this will significantly improve the credit quality of your book, because these students are actually going to pass. Let's give them that support. Let's hold their hand. Let's help them to be successful. And I think if we can achieve that, then we are going to see a huge reduction in the dropout rates and in the you know, fall off rates of students that we are currently seeing. So thanks for the question, Kaya.
No, thanks for that, Monet. I think obviously the lessons from ISFAP are definitely important for the system at large. I think, you know, some of the comments that you see is that it's great how ISFAP goes beyond the funding for students and offering additional support. That is indeed a game changer. And Dr. Matutu, I mean, I'm curious here, in now that we understand that there is clearly a big upside to comprehensive funding that goes beyond just the baseline academic costs. Is this then a matter of a policy conversation that we should be having to say to the states that, look, it is no longer sufficient for an agency like NSFAS, for example, to simply say to university, well, how much are your courses and how much is your accommodation, and therefore that's the allocation to the student. If there's very clear evidence that indicates to us that actually the provision of additional support is as important as the provision of the core financial support in order to ensure that students succeed, in order to ensure that our financing systems are viable, then this is the way we should go. Is this something that we should be pursuing at the policy level, or we're simply just hoping that enough people sit across the room eventually one day and then say, well, actually, let us do it differently?
As the University of South Africa, last year, which was 2023, we came up with this student-centered approach within the university, which is student-centered. And it has got a number of areas of focus. So within universities, there are student support services. Already we have workshopped this report with them. Of course, all the university vice chancellors constitute the board of USAF. So they adopted it and they felt that it needed to be spread across the system. So certainly anything to do with being student-centered is an area that we embrace fully with as University of South Africa. And we have built evidence around that on what then has to come into it. The issue becomes affordability on some of the things. You'll find out that some of the universities, as the one from UCT is mentioning, already have adopted the issues of mentors and mentorship among their students. So these things, as I've mentioned previously, they are just cascading into the institutions at a broader level. And you'll find out that sometimes they just start with certain scarce skills areas where the success has not been that much. And then they permeate towards the entire university. So being student-centered is an area that has gained a lot of prominence within the higher education sector. And this wraparound support is very, very crucial for the students. And universities are trying by all means to adopt and find ways and means of supporting the students. You'll find out that, for instance, most of them do have offices with the resident psychologists. They will have clinics within the university, and all these things become part of the culture and the support within the IT support and all of that, even for students. All these things are coming in now to support the students in their journey of acquiring their qualifications.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
let me move on and go on to the issue of the world of work. As University of South Africa, we have identified this area as quite a crucial one for universities. So we've got a world of work strategy group which reports to the board on some of the priority areas that we should be focusing on as universities. So work integrated learning is a crucial component of that, which ensures that the students are ready, are work ready, and also the private sector, or at least the workplace, the student, the curriculum, all these things talk to each other. As of this morning, I had a meeting where we're proposing a policy which could perhaps be adopted in this work integrated learning. So I will come to the SETAs because this requires a lot of money. When the universities have to establish these offices and ensure that there are people who are well equipped to interface with the private sector, advisors, associations, and all of those things to get the students not only to have experience in the workplace environment, but also to influence the curriculum on the part of our employers. Similarly, with entrepreneurship, it's one of our flagship programs, which is being funded by the Department of Higher Education and Training. We have a whole ambit of programs to ensure that entrepreneurship becomes institutionalized within the higher education institutions. So these are the areas where we're being supported by private sector, Standard Bank, for instance, and some of the SETAs will have to come to the party when it comes to these programs and ensuring that they become part of our higher education system.
No, thank you, Dr. Matutu. Vincent, I've got a bit of a curveball question for you here from Lutendo. It says, do you believe that missing middle funding should only fund scarce skills or should fund all degrees? And I think obviously the context here is that resources are limited. We may not know what the budget is for the loan scheme or for NSFAS at any point in time, but no one is going to even pretend that the resources are infinite. And of course, the question of, well, if there has to be a prioritization process, should there be one? Is it justifiable? And how would one even implement it? I don't know. What's your view?
Kaya, we would like as a university that all our programs are funded because it's in the interest of the university, and we believe in the programs that we are offering and how they would benefit this country. Unfortunately, when one starts thinking about funding and the partners that we collaborate with, they have their own vested interest, and that's why then what happens is funding is limited to a certain sector. But that's not what we think should happen, but we understand the context it exists in. We, of course, in programs which are not funded, are engaging with other parties interested in those and finding alternative forms of funding. And as the university, if you go to our website under financial support, you'd be able to get a comprehensive list of all programs that are being funded by different stakeholders within the university.
Thank you for that, Vincent. Robin, there was a question directed at you. Is the plan for tackling student debts already in progress, or in process of being executed, or what's the status there? And I think you probably were mentioning earlier on that obviously student debt is a permanent problem that has to be addressed decisively. What are your insights onto how far we are in relation to that? And that's a question from Amkelekile.
So what certainly helps is the information, right? We rely very much on data and information to be shared with us, I think, as stakeholders across the board, and that helps one to craft a response. So Lisa mentioned earlier on that SETA doesn't necessarily work with universities, but they do work with NSFAS, which is more of a central point. As EWSETA, we've got partnerships and collaboration agreements with most of the universities in South Africa. And on an annual basis, we have the nature of our partnership and stakeholder engagement is such that there's this two-way communication, and it's open for universities to communicate with us if there's particular student debt challenges that are accumulating. And so it's normally if there's a lot of students or that are faced with this challenge, or in a specific faculty, it might be that sort of thing. So we get that information from universities on an annual basis, and we kind of assess then across the board how we are able to respond to that. And in many cases, we often have partnerships with individual universities for the relevant faculties, and they would ask, we would commit to a certain amount of bursary funding. We would say, like, we will do 30 learners, 50 learners, 100 learners, whatever it might be. But sometimes universities then come back to us and say, you know what, instead of funding a new cohort or doing full bursary funding, we've got this particular cohort where we're seeing a challenge around debt, around getting the degrees or accessing the results, whatever the case might be. And so we do assist with those. I know that we are not the only SETA who does it. So that's so far how we've been addressing the challenge. And obviously what would assist is if we start to sort of bring our thinking together and bring our work together. If we had a lot of transparency around where the particular pockets of challenges sit at universities, we'd be able to then craft a response to those. So student debt has been one of those. It's come up, and that's how we've addressed it. And I know we're not the only institution doing that.
Thanks for that, Robin. There's also a question, but I'd like to pose it to Disa first, and that's a question of whether ISFAP funds interns who like to further their studies. And the reason I want to pose it to you as SETA is that obviously you do provide particular grants and support structures for people that are already in the workplace in order to either finance learnerships. But does that then also translate into providing academic support for those that might be in a learnership? We know that it is, of course, a transitionary process, but those people might be willing to pursue further education. How do SETAs deal with that particular conundrum? I'll start with you, Disa, and then move to Robin.
Thank you. Thanks, Kaya. So we do have in our annual performance plan, we have different targets, and one of them would talk to postgraduate students who want to complete their, or PhD students. So we do offer that kind of support, and I know that we are not the only SETA. SETAs across the board do give support for postgrad or PhD related or masters. Is that the question, Kaya, in terms of if is our focus on undergrad, or do we also give support for post?
I think it was focusing on people who are working as interns and want to further their studies.
Yeah, we do. Okay, as SETA, and I think all SETAs, we do have an internship program internally, but they don't necessarily have access to our funding in terms if they wanted to further their studies. But what we do is that we do give money to enable that, to facilitate that kind of training to different institutions. So it's something that we do, but as SETA, it's something that we really need to look into, because we've had questions about, for example, what Robin was talking into, student debt. We've got interns who have joined the organization who want to further their studies, but they are only limited to a certain amount that they get. Is SETA willing to look into that? So it is something that we are looking into personally, but in other, when we give funding, we do give funding for those kind of initiatives with various institutions.
All right, thank you very much for that. Robin, at EWSETA, do you sort of have any support structures for people that are interns, but also want to pursue further studies?
Yes, so from the internship perspective, we work with several industry organizations or businesses in energy and water, particularly large ones, but we do have programs for support for small and medium-sized businesses. And also industry associations where we fund the actual internship program. Sometimes it's top-up funding and sometimes it's a complete stipend for an intern, and that's just to get into the internship space. But from a bursaries perspective, we've got an approach that looks at employed and also unemployed bursaries. So bursaries for people who are employed or bursaries for people who are unemployed. And the unemployed is typically your fresh out of school or 1 or 2 years out of school and not necessarily having worked before. The employed is where we would look at interns and other individuals that are already working wherever it might be that they're working, who then want to pursue further studies. And so we do consider that as bursaries from a bursary funding perspective. Again, with our bursaries, we work directly with institutions, higher education institutions and TVET colleges, but then we also have several bursary schemes that we avail through other partners. ISFAP is one of them. And then also, of course, partners like your industry associations, etc., where we fund the bursaries in the background. If you go on LinkedIn or Facebook or the websites, you won't necessarily see EWSETA there, but we assist those institutions to expand the access that they can provide by scaling up their programs.
All right, thank you for that. Dr. Matutu, there's also another question that perhaps you might have insights into, and it's a question that says, is there a possibility of the loan scheme being provided on a sliding scale with a portion of it being converted into a bursary based on a student's household income? And that's a question from Bulelwa. And I think from what we recall, NSFAS used to have a convertible loan system where a part of it could be converted into a grant. But in relation to this one, I know the minister may have alluded to it, but can you give us some insight onto what you as Yusuf understood this new scheme to incorporate in terms of the conversion element, or if there is any conversion at all?
The thing that I heard was that the conversion will be possible depending on the performance. It was not linked to income. It was linked to performance of the student. Looking at the very small window between 350 and 600, I cannot imagine any kind of sliding scale emanating from that, unless we're talking about an expanded loan scheme, which goes beyond that. That's a very a small window that we're talking about. So the chances of that happening, I think would be quite small. But if you are looking at it holistically, starting from 0 to 600, certainly there's a sliding scale where those between 0 and 350 are getting free funding from a fee-free funding from government. And then those above 350 are getting the loans, and above 350 to 600, and those who perform well get part of that converted into a bursary. So that in itself is a sliding scale on its own, if one is considering that.
There was also another question. As my screen is just frozen, that I can't see. Yeah.
Before we get into that, it's such a pity that the students who are excelling regardless of the income, there is almost absolutely nothing for them, which I think is such a pity, because we do need to encourage our students to excel. So the fact that they are above a particular threshold is such a pity, but at least institutions such as the National Research Foundation look at that. Those students who are excelling regardless of the income get some level of support. I think that is an area that would have to look into in future.
Okay, thank you. I lost the question because my screen is frozen, but it was a question that sort of reflected on, the problem that some families have, in that you may have more than one student in higher education at the same time. So, of course, even if we said 350,000 Rand was the right reference point in relation to one child, when you have more than one child, it does seem that, there are still problems with how the model has been designed. Should you then be considered for free higher education? I don't know. I mean, is that another policy dilemma that we have to grapple with as a country?
I think in its revisions, if one checks this year, the revisions of the NSFAS guidelines, this issue of having more than one child within a family is being addressed. I'm talking about now, not the loan scheme. I'm talking about between 0 and 350 and above. So it looks like it's something that they are prepared to consider. Please just go and check the 2024 guidelines, which came out just a few days ago, I think last Friday or so. They've got definitions there that they have strengthened. And I think this issue of having more than one sibling at university is among the issues which are being addressed.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and maybe Vincent, you can tap into this one if possible. It's a question from Yogashan at the Mercury, who wants to know if the introduction of the new government-backed loan scheme can be explained. And I think the crux of the question is, as universities, you obviously are the institutions that should be given insights into what will happen over the next couple of weeks until the 15th, which is when it closes, and also how do you then ensure that students are funded. Have we seen any developments in relation to how government has communicated how the scheme will actually practically work?
Kaya, in actual fact, we've been sent as university this week documentation by NSFAS in terms of how that would work. We are busy reviewing it for implementation. So I suppose when we have more details, we would be communicating as UCT through different channels for our students to know how it would work about. So it's still too early for me to give details on it.
All right, no, that's quite important. And there are indeed polls that are being put on the chat. So if you have some time, if you can give us some insights and some contributions on the polls, so we'll definitely welcome that because it informs how we structure these conversations going for the future. We're almost out of time. And I think obviously having reflected on this particular development, it is still early stages. We are still going to wait and see how it gets rolled out and how it gets implemented. And it's something that we need to continuously reflect on. So I do think that there will probably be follow-up conversations in relation to this. And I'm going to give now my panelists just 1 minute as a closing remark to be able to say, now that we've found a way of financing missing middle students differently and perhaps more creatively, how do we ensure that this remains a successful program, and what should we watch out for as citizens and higher education stakeholders to ensure that this best placed or best intentioned model does indeed deliver the right outcomes? I'll start with you, Dr. Matutu. Final words from you.
From our side, as I mentioned, very much most welcome. And as mentioned, all of us as South Africans have to come to the party in terms of education of our students. So we welcome this initiative and may it go from strength to strength. And as University of South Africa, we are part of ensuring that it succeeds in whatever way that we can be called to contribute.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Matutu. Vincent, over to you.
Kaya, my screen has something on it, so I'm trying to close it. Kaya, there is no denying what higher education and having access to it does for the community and for our people at large. So it is very key that we find ways that in providing access to it, we're able to support it financially. I think there are efforts that we are making in the short term. We do need to think in the long term. And I spoke about building an endowment fund, specifically focusing on higher education. It requires some sacrifices and some patience. But if all of us were to contribute to it and we manage it in best ways we know how, and there are many models in terms from a governance point of view and overseeing that endowment fund, we can make success of it. Many of the universities do have endowments funds, but are restricted to certain areas and not so much into funding students' fees, as it were. So if we can do that and think creatively, I think we may be able to realize free education because it's not sustainable to continually ask money in and money out and, without building some form of capital. So I'm an advocate of thinking about how do we build this capital and how do we make sure there's good governance of it and understanding that it will require some time and implement it. And we may be funding more than just that cap of 600,000 because in it, it's exclusionary by its nature. And then we can work together within the sector and collaborating with people outside the sector to realize this. Thank you, Kaya. Thanks for everyone else
Thank you very
who's
much,
been able to join
Vincent.
us.
Disa, over to you.
Thanks, Kaya. Very much supported from the SETA side. The approach, I think Dr. Matutu also said it, all hands on deck, public-private partnerships must be explored, and I think ISFAP is already doing that. We need to, I'm a huge advocate of the cradle-to-grave approach. I think if we can start with young people at a very young age, so that by the time they enter the PSET sector, then they choose courses or degrees that will enable them to enter the job market. So that career guidance also should be part of the solution to this, and also how the economy grows, because if you have this funding model that talks about debt, there's only one way they can service the debt is if they work or they're entrepreneurs. So if this economy is not growing, then we'll be sitting with the young people who are sitting with debt they cannot service. I've been there. I know how it feels to be burdened by a student loan. So we need to ensure that as we have these conversations, also how do all the sectors support, not necessarily really at an education level, how do we ensure that there's a growth in the economy to ensure that young people, when they exit these institutions, can get access to job opportunities or they become entrepreneurs so that they can service this debt and the money goes back to their purse to fund more young people. And I support also the Dr. Mutola in terms of what he's saying, in terms of how we can think about different funding models over and above what we're doing now. Thank you, Kaya.
Thank you very much for that, Disa. Robin, last word from you, please.
So from our side, yes, very much. We're very much in support of and excited for this this development in our higher education space, and in the funding challenges specifically. I've seen the minister announcing the scheme, but I've not seen a lot of publicizing around this, and it really is a great route for access, I think, to learners that we have previously missed. And so I would really encourage those of us who are here who might not have known much about the scheme before, but who perhaps know a bit more and who actually do have knowledge about it, to just share it out there, share the students. We want to see those applications coming into NSFAS, put the pressure on us as the higher education system so that we are also forced to put our weight and our support behind the system, however it is that we support NSFAS and the broader support, the broader community of support behind this loan scheme. It's going to create more opportunities in the system. It's going to bring more funds into the system. I agree with what Vincent is talking about in terms of sustainability and looking forward. But for right now, let's also just ensure that people are able to leverage this opportunity for access and use it. And as higher education, we'll put our weight behind it as well to make it a success and something that as a country we can be proud of.
Thank you very much, Robin, for those comments. And thank you very much to my panelists for having joined us. Unfortunately, we are fast running out of time. And I think for me, obviously, the key takeaway here is that after many years of struggling with this question and this complexity of how missing middle students need to be funded, it has become very clear that this move by the Department of Higher Education to open up a loan scheme for missing middle students is a first but very important step towards really sorting out not just the financing crisis and the funding crisis, but also the progression and the success crisis that we now know. We also know that institutions like ISFAP have given us a template for what needs to be done in order to ensure that the financial access is then matched by academic success, in order to ensure that our young people that enter the system eventually manage to transition out of it and be able to play their rightful role in South Africa's economy. And how we get there is indeed going to be a question of collaboration. It's going to be a question of partnerships. And it's also going to be a question of conversations of this nature that enable most of us to understand what is happening, to then understand what it is that we can do in order to contribute to the development development of the country's skills pipeline. And on that note, I'd like to appeal to all of you to play whatever role you can in the spaces that you're in to be able to contribute meaningfully towards this national pursuit of ensuring that our young people are able to access higher education, succeed in higher education, so that the country can have the skills that it needs in order to proceed and to progress and to prosper. Thank you very much for that. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you very much to the ISPAP team for having put this together. My name is Kasitole. Hope to see you soon for a follow-up conversation about the issues that are so critical in the higher education landscape. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Kaya. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Kaya.
Kaya. Chat soon.